Okay, so I was born on the 20th of August 1973 at 10 to midnight in Brisbane, so I just made it. I remained in hospital for surgery from August until I had the surgery on Boxing Day. So the reason why I needed the surgery was to repair a cleft lip, which means it had two splits in my front lip, so my lip hadn't actually formed properly, and a cleft palate, which was there was a hole in the roof of my mouth. And so throughout primary school, I had various other appointments, such as surgery on my weak eye, that they corrected or they cut the tissues behind my weak eye to strengthen it, to bring it back into alignment, and appointments with a speech pathologist to help me pronounce letters and sounds correctly, and appointments with orthodontists and general dentist appointments, such as braces to straighten my teeth, as I wasn't born with two upper teeth, and then in primary school having false teeth with a full plate because the hole in the roof of my mouth wasn't totally sealed. So my last surgery, when I was about 12 or 13 years of age, was to actually raise up the bridge of my nose, and they inserted a bone in there. So that was the end of that, of the surgeries. The title for my talk tonight is No Coincidence, because I know God's been working throughout my life, especially before I even knew him. And God has put people in my path to reveal himself to me. And the verse that came to me was Romans 10:17, where it says that, well, to me personally, my faith came from hearing. That is, it was hearing the good news about Christ, and that was through others that God had put into my life. So I'll start with Mum and Dad. They're Pat and Lynn. This is a photo of them on their wedding day. So Dad was born in Melbourne and Mum was born at the Rock, just outside Wagga in New South Wales. They knew each other when Mum was about 13 and they met at a dance in Wagga. They married at Wagga on the 13th of September 1969, and 3 years after they had met. My brother was born shortly after. So to put all of this into perspective, Mum was 16 when she married Dad, which is Ethan's age at the moment. And when my brother was born, and at 17, she was a mum when my brother was born, and then me 3 years later when she was 20. So I've often admired Mum for all she's done for me at such a young age, considering her own mum died when Mum was about 10 years old. So my dad was the eldest child with two brothers and two sisters. His childhood, for most part, was without a stable father figure. His stepdad took his own life, and so did his two brothers. A lot of the family responsibility Dad took on himself. He was like a dad to his other brothers and sisters. And one thing I do admire about Dad was that when something was dealt with, such as perhaps something was dealt with me growing up, he never ever mentioned it again. It was dealt with, it was done, and he moved on. Here are just a few photos of myself and my brother. And I think we're in Brisbane then. I'm not too sure. So, my childhood. Between 1979 and 1991, I went to 5 different primary schools, ranging from Perth, Western Australia, to Karratha. We lived in a caravan park in Karratha. Mum and Dad managed that caravan park there. I repeated year 3, just for the fact of moving so much. And then we lived in Wagga, New South Wales. Then we moved to Queensland and a few changes of schools. And then I finally went to one high school, which I was happy about. During these 13 years, my family obviously did a lot of travelling and moved between a lot of different states. So a road trip for me was always interesting, and I really loved it. So going to many different primary schools had its challenges, such as the need to belong and fit in. It was of primary importance to me, because I just always seemed to stand out being that new kid all the time. And knowing that, yeah, I looked a little bit different, but then knowing we all look a little bit different anyway. So actually one thing that when I was 1, Mum would have me come home from school for lunch. In year 1, she would have me come home from school for lunch. And we lived at the back of the school, and I climbed through a hole in the fence just to get home, and I really didn't want to go because I just wanted to fit in at school. And I think she really missed me. I think during that time we had, she had a lot to deal with, but yeah, we were really close, and so she had really missed me. In 1979, when I was in year 1 in Perth, I went to Sunday school, and this was the first time I heard about God. This was a Catholic church, and while I don't remember too much about it, that was really where it started for me, where the seed was planted, I do believe. These are a few photos of growing up within the Collins family. So in our home, as a kid, it seemed anything was possible, and life really was an adventure. And I think this is mostly because of Dad. If it seemed it couldn't be done, he'd find a way. And also the saying of, yeah, she'll be right, was often said a lot. As a kid, I really did believe anything was possible. So the extended Collins family would always gather together around music and food, and alcohol was always present amongst those gatherings and celebrations. Unfortunately, there was just too much alcohol, and it had its impact. And this was also a part of my life, and it continued with me until God showed up at a certain point, which I'll share later. As you can see, that there, my brother is sleeping under some blanket. It was supposed to be a tent, but we did the best with what we had. And it was all that we needed, and we loved it. These were some photos of me at school. As you can see, everyone is a different school uniform, but it was a school uniform. That was the whole thing with Mum. No matter what they had, some things were a priority, and I could see that that was one of them. So at one point when I was in high school, I remember that there was a Christian band that came to the school, and after they had played, they asked if anybody had any questions and they could come forward. I really felt I had a prompting to go forward, but I didn't at that stage. But still, God was showing up. So after high school, the following year, in 1992, I moved to Gympie to study accounting. While there, you may have heard this story. Yes, the prawn is there. If you were here last Sunday night, you would have heard about the prawn. I was invited to a party, and after declining the invitation a couple of times and being pestered, I went along. I had it in my mind that I would just show up and I would walk out. That's what I had in my mind. And it was proven true, because I walked in and there was just a whole heap of guys there. There was only one girl, so I thought, no, I'm leaving. However, this handsome man must have felt sorry for me, and he thought by asking me if I wanted a prawn, I would feel at ease. Well, I felt at ease, but it wasn't the prawn that made me feel at ease. So obviously this is Steve, and we started dating. He was the most genuine, kind and respectful man that I had ever come across. Not long after meeting Steve, again, Mum missed me, I went back to Brisbane to finish studying. And Steve was in his last year of forestry and he went back to Cairns for work. He had finished studying. But before both of us left Gympie, and this is where the talk comes in, he explained to me his faith and his upbringing. And I remember at the time, in my mind, it just made sense, this being an important part of who Steve was. It was just right in my mind. We kept in contact with many holidays in Cairns and me up there, and he came to Brisbane. And I just knew that when he met Dad, I just knew Dad liked him straight away. There was just something there. But Steve just seemed to get along with everybody. And God showed up there too, through Steve. So the proposal was over the phone, which wasn't great, but I didn't care. I had my man. So at the time, my parents were in Cairns for a holiday, and so Steve went around and to their accommodation and asked if he could marry me, even though he'd already asked me, so this was just a formality. Anyway, and it all went well, except for Mum, again. But I just had to finish studying. That was her request. So later on that night, Mum and Dad went around to Steve's parents' place and they had dinner, but the whole proposal was not mentioned because my mum and dad weren't sure if they knew, and Steve's parents weren't sure what went down with the conversation. So nobody said anything. So after I finished studying, I moved to Cairns, and this was the start of '94, because Steve was working in Tully and I lived with Nev and Jean, his parents, for a while. At this time, I was so out to impress them, as I felt I needed their approval. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, whereas I know Steve did. He explained that to me. At this stage, this was the first time I thought I just wasn't good enough because I wasn't a Christian. I felt like that's what I needed, but little realising we're all not good enough at the time. So while I was there, I was looking for work and I was planning a wedding and trying to impress. I couldn't find any job and I didn't know what the reason why was. So the reason why was because just before we got married, Steve got a job at Imbil, just outside Gympie. So after the wedding, we went back to Gympie. That's where we lived after we got married. In Gympie, there was a couple, Ian and Joy Richards. Ian was the minister at the Gympie Presbyterian Church, and both of them spent a lot of time with me. They invested a lot of time with me in explaining the gospel and bringing me to Jesus, and that's where I accepted him as my saviour. There was still a lot of ground to cover, but that was the point where it was the new beginnings of my Christian life. And I can still remember standing at the front of the church accepting him into my life. I can still remember that day. We were in Gympie for a while, and then we moved to Toowoomba. Again, Steve got a new job in forestry. So that's why we moved. But however, when we got there, I found a job and I started before he did. So it was very much a clear path. For me, Toowoomba was a time of hearing God's word and Christian fellowship. Reverend David Seckham, who's not in those photos there, he was the minister at the Prezi Church, and he provided really solid biblical teaching that to Steve and I. We would meet at Matt and Juliet's home, which is a couple together at the bottom, the last photo at the bottom. And we would meet there for Bible study with a number of other young married couples. And another friend, Peter Diamond, who you can see, he's not in the top photo, he's in the blue. He was someone you couldn't forget. He was absolute chaos, but somehow he was organised at the same time. But yeah, he served on the Doulos boat, which was a boat that had a floating library. It would bring God's word into different countries. We financially supported him to do this, and now we know he's a minister at a Prezi church on the Sunshine Coast. So a lot of these things I can see now that it's reflected into what we're doing here in Yeppoon, is continuing with Bible studies, supporting other Christian, like Compassion, which is what we're doing now. So I can see a lot of these connections have carried through to Yeppoon. The photo at the top, next to the word Toowoomba, is of Greg Claydon, who was the Regional Service Director for the Darling Downs around Toowoomba region. I sensed there was something unique about the way he worked. His honesty, he's just genuine, and he was kind. He was a Christian, and it was such a privilege to work with him. He provided many great challenges for me and seemed to be calm about giving me the responsibility while I was quietly freaking out, because it was a lot of responsibility that he was handing over to me. I was surprised each time that it actually turned out okay. He then stepped it up again, so he didn't just let me cruise, he just stepped it up again with something else. And though it wasn't easy, I had learnt so much through him, how in which he worked, and just using him as a really good sounding board to help me. And when he moved to Brisbane, that job just wasn't the same. And not long after this, I was pregnant with Ethan. So just after Ethan's first birthday, Steve got a new job again. But this time he was successful with 2 jobs. One was in Brisbane and one was at Byfield. So this was a tough decision. I could hear Mum way down in Brisbane going, "Come, come." But it just wasn't that easy. I had a sense that where we moved to next was crucial, because we were raising our family. And it was clearly a time when only God could make this decision. So once we knew what it was, we knew it was actually the right choice. It was the right decision. So here's Ethan. This is Ethan, and this is Dad and Ethan. Ethan was born on the 2nd of April 2003, on our anniversary. After having Ethan, I wasn't able to get out of bed. And many other things just didn't turn out how I thought they should have. Steve was so capable in helping me. He cared for Ethan, doing the feeding and bathing and bringing Ethan to me at all hours, because Ethan didn't sleep. He just fed. Steve was such a great strength to me. This was the first time I saw that his strength is really showing love through his actions. And through my weaknesses, I could see Steve's strength really clearly. Okay, so the choice was made and we moved to Yeppoon. Even though we knew it was the right choice, it still really wasn't easy. This move was the hardest for me. The security of the new beginnings in Toowoomba seemed really distant to me. Steve was busy working at Byfield, and I basically found myself in a deep, dark hole of postnatal depression. I I felt alone and separated from family and friends. The distance from anywhere, living in central Queensland, just was great. It just felt so distant from anywhere and anyone. But at the same time, I put upon myself unnecessary pressure and expectations of being a mum. And at the time, we were building a home also. I remember once I had started meeting new friends, again, God putting them in my path, through a few churches that we were attending at the time, and getting involved, that God really was always with me. I was working at the Yeppoon Active Recreation Centre when I was pregnant with Ella. Ella was born on the 21st of August 2008, the day after my birthday. Not long after Ella was born, Dad was sitting next to me, and I could sense, something about him. I think he was concerned that I would be in a similar situation after having Ethan. And so he asked me a few questions, and he reassured me that I was a good mum. This was really special for me because Dad showed he was here for me even if it wasn't all right. His saying, "She'll be right," just went out the window. He was just there for me. When we were in Brisbane, this is a couple of years after Ella was born, we were in Brisbane celebrating Dad's 60th. I remember still having too much to drink, too much alcohol, and this was a regular occurrence. Many times I would just be sick and Steve would be there helping me through. There was a moment when God showed up, and there was a moment when Ella looked at me and I looked at Ella, and whether I was seeing Ella or seeing something that God wanted to communicate to me at the time, I knew, and I remember thinking, no more. This stops with me. So that was it. God has shown me that this is not going to be a generational thing throughout my family. And then in late 2011, we started attending church here. This felt like home. It sounded like home. And it was home. It is here when my faith was really my faith. It wasn't that of Steve's or anyone else's. It's here where I proudly worshipped my Lord. I remember when I was standing, and we would have been somewhere over there, and it was around the time when Steve, it was around the cyclone time. He was extremely busy and stressed, and God showed up again. And while it wasn't easy to just, okay, I have to go to church, I have to get up, I have to get kids together, and I just have to go. Steve couldn't be here for me at that time. And I just realised that while I was over there and I was worshipping, and I realised it was the most natural thing for me to do, even if there was no one else there. I think Ethan was on sound, Ella was in Sunday school, I was there on my own. And I knew right then, like, I was standing here for Jesus, and it didn't depend on what anybody else was doing. I was here and I was worshipping him. That's when it took a real difference. It became more so personal and real for me. There were many other things through this church that have really helped me, and it's mostly been through the solid teaching, of Pastor On, and earlier on when we did first start to come, and Ella was young and I was at home with her and Kieran investing her time in me, and that's what I hear a lot of Kieran doing. She invests time in people, and that is just so important. And when I had a Bible study at my home, that was especially important, and just many other things that just, they weren't coincidences. The mental health first aid, that was extremely helpful for me in understanding it, and very, very relevant. So to conclude, I know I need to keep my eyes fixed on the Lord, because he renews my strength, he guides me along the right paths, and this is all just to bring honour and glory to his name. So thank you.